Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the future of theology, essays to honor Jürgen Moltmann, edited by Volf. In this lesson, I combined Solle and Hauerwas. I combined their two essays together for a lesson that will entail pages 21 to 35. Because the two essays really have a perfect fit. So good editing by Volf to have these two essays together, back up to each other. Let's take a look at block 1 and look at Solle on kneeling and walking upright. We're told, through a subjective hermeneutic of suspicion, the Church has been able to take up critical self-reflection. Prophetic criticism has been applied to Christianity itself toward a church that always is in need of reformation. So there's always the objective need for reformation. We take up a critical consciousness that moves beyond the negation of fundamentalism and postmodernism, constructing a form in dialectical relation to scientific world. And against this scientific world, we have to ask, what makes up the Protestant principle when in relation to the scientific world? Well, it begins with negation, and then it'll take up affirmation. So note 3, the Protestant principle and the step of negation. A technological rationality pervades our culture. Real religion has become science, which is not self-critical, and it continues to exploit nature. Theology needs to emerge and posit a different vision of the good, a radically different vision of the good. That's the negation side of the Protestant principle. Now let's take a look at the affirmation side. We affirm a Protestant principle free from domination, positing a preference for life over death, emerging out of an ontological surplus of being, or what Moltmann called a surplus of promise, which posits faith in the Creator and the blessedness of creation, resulting in the self living in a living thankfulness. So we live in a living thankfulness to take up this surplus of promise. We perceive life as gift, and we take up a subjective participation of devotion, where things are called into existence that do not exist, Romans 4:17, through our capacity to reflect God, to reflect the divine being. That leads us to Glauben, engage creatively with creation, to Glauben, engage creatively with creation. So the engagement with creation, we work and love as the image of God. We enter into God, toward the real of God, and the return moment of retrieving our partiality for life. There is always a return moment out of ministry, and it will inform our partiality for real life within a dialectic of turn and return. And our participation in this dialectic of turn and return contributes to the reign of God. That gives us our subjective need. It gives us actually the objective reality of a surplus of promise, a surplus of being that asks for our subjective and objective participation. But it gives us the definite objective presence of a surplus of promise. And that beginning is what we need if we're going to enter into genuine engagement with creation in Block 2. Now we switch over to Hauerwas in Block 2 and 3. So Block 2, we look at the objective engagement with creation. We begin by recognizing that Moltmann posited a genuine Christian postmodern view. Moltmann taught us to imagine our world eschatologically. How do we apply this to the most postmodern world? For Moltmann, that meant that formal theology cannot be separated from the praxis of the church. In other words, he was postmodern before there ever was a term postmodern. He was already beginning with praxis. And he was already negating the modernity position. So Block 2, Note 2, negating and moving beyond the modernity position. Knowledge is not centered in human rationality. God is much more than the God of the gaps. The world can only be properly understood within the concept of God's narrative, God's story for all of creation. The church's role is to define the character of this ontological landscape which is calling for our participation. We are not simply to make the gospel intelligible. That was the modern position. We are to negate that position of 19th and early 20th century of rationally trying to posit a gospel that is intelligible. So, note 3, real post-modernity plus negated modernity equals the church of passionate engagement. We negate modernity's high humanism theory, which is devoid of passion, because it simply posited management of congregations. This is where fundamentalism wakes us up, because they always act on their convictions. And that usually will result in having enemies. Christianity is unintelligible without enemies, says Hauerwas. The church is not to fall into becoming a Constantinian settlement, an ally to this high humanism theory of modern culture. We have to move beyond that to a true postmodernism, and that means, for Hauerwas, a Moltmannian postmodernism, which is a phenomenology that is centered in Christ. That is Moltmann's postmodernism, a phenomenology centered in Christ. Moltmann has been called a right-wing Hegelian, and as opposed to the postmodern left-wing Hegelians. I always have viewed Moltmann as perfectly centered Hegelian, because I've always recognized that Moltmann posits and has posited a Christ-centered phenomenology, a Christian Christ-centered phenomenology, perfectly centered, balancing the left and the right. I don't see him as extreme right. I certainly don't see him falling into the left, but he perfectly balances the two and thereby presents a Christ-centered phenomenology. That is the position we have to support. We cannot fall into a Constantinian settlement. Let's move on to Block 3. The objective surplus of being and the subjective defining of God's narrative equals praxis engagement with creation, Glauben. We form our theology within the midst of war, a war against domination and war, a war against war, which means forming a theological strategy and combating against nihilism, the negative of nihilism, the self-destructive nihilism. We negate this nihilism. Today, nihilism has become a trap of the self taking up a self-devaluating values. which are contingent values, and falling into a tolerance of conceptual contingency. Concepts don't have the ontological authority and power that they had, because now we fall into this tolerance of conceptual contingency. Life is commitment to contingent values. Therefore, Hauerwas says we must negate the tolerance of conceptual contingency. It creates a liberal social order. Life becomes equated with lifestyle, and we become powerless to create an alternative narrative. Freedom becomes institutionalized. We must negate institutionalized freedom, and that's market capitalism and liberal social order. Instead, we must emerge to define our own concept, real concept of existence, or the concept of real existence. And that means the concept of real existence in Christ. Defining one's concept of existence. It is the mysterion, it is the mystery of human life. It will negate false ideologies of freedom by recognizing that life is a gift, informed by the gospel, which is embodied in Christian community, where we discover God's story for our lives, a narrative for us, a narrative that takes up all of creation and gathers and calls for the participation of the self and the self within community in a praxis engagement with creation, a Glauben participation. These two essays perfectly complement each other, and Volf put them one in front of the other precisely for that reason. They fit perfectly together. And in Block 1, we do truly learn that the subjective hermeneutic of critical suspicion and the objective need for reformation in the church leads to positing the Protestant principle by two means, negation and affirmation. We have to negate the technological rationality. We have to posit a different, a new, and a real vision of the good. Affirmation means that we affirm the divine surplus of promise that exists in reality. There are latent tendencies asking for us to take them up as the kingdom moves forward. We need to take up Moltmann's surplus of promise, or surplus of being, and affirm that reality, and to live thankfully in participation in those latent tendencies. And that way we do engage creatively with creation. And that took us on to Block 2. Then we got to look at defining God's narrative. And that means that we have to take up a negation of the modern position, which was human rationality and the God of the gaps, and instead seek to really define the real ontological landscape, which is centered in Christ. And that means we're not just trying to make the gospel intelligible. Instead, it becomes a challenging, transformative word. Challenging, transformative word that calls us to participate in a Christ-centered phenomenology that was given to us by Jürgen Moltmann before there was even a concept of postmodern. Moltmann posited a Christ-centered phenomenology that challenges the radically left-wing postmodernism of today. And then that brought us on to the fact that we should engage in a passionate engagement through the church, negate high humanism theory of the 19th and early 20th century, and realize that we will have enemies. We will have enemies those that want to keep affirming the Constantinian settlement of the church, we want to stay passionately involved in taking up the surplus of promise that is always leading us ahead in self-identity and in kingdom identity. That brought us on to block 3. And there we really did get a great look at Moltmann's theology of praxis engagement with creation. It is a praxis engagement with creation. That is why Hauerwas was correct in saying that Moltmann posited an authentic postmodernism before postmodernism existed. He posited a center position postmodernism against any radically left-wing postmodernism, which is prevalent today. His centered postmodernism is a praxis of the church postmodernism that is Christ-centered. So we do negate nihilism. Primarily we negate what we fall entrapped to, a tolerance of conceptual contingency. If we tolerate everybody's concepts and say that no concept is real, no concept is true, we fall into a trap of tolerance of conceptual contingency. Values are contingent. We tolerate everything. That is to be negated, and that means negating the institutionalized freedom of market capitalism and liberal social order to reach a true concept of existence. And that's when we want to move on and truly form a concept of existence where we recognize life as gift through the grace of God through Jesus Christ. In other words, we recognize life as gift through the gospel, through the truth and the reality of the gospel. That curves us back to block 1, dialectically, where we take up the affirmation of the surplus of being again. That calls for us to subjectively participate in writing and forming God's narrative. And that will again inform our next praxis mission. So we'll get a great combined lesson from 2 essays, Solle and Hauerwas, and I think it came together to really point out Moltmann's authentic phenomenology. Moltmann has always posited a Christ-centered phenomenology that precisely balanced and continues to balance the left and the right. He is not right-wing Hegelian. That's a wrong label. He is certainly not left-wing Hegelian. But he posits a Christ-centered phenomenology. And he balances the left and the right dialectically because he begins with praxis, and he begins with the objective world and praxis, but he also begins with the truth of the gospel and Jesus Christ. That's going to wrap up pages 21 to 35. We're going to pick up next time on page 36.